Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at a collection of information about James Anthony Frederick,
Right?
a name tied to a series of murders in Florida.
Mm.
We've got Wikipedia excerpts, newspaper articles. Looks like this case spanned at least a decade.
Wow.
So we're going to try to piece together a timeline of his crimes, figure out how he was finally caught, and explore how technology plays a role in solving these cold cases.
So what's interesting about this case is we already know who committed these crimes.
Right?
The information's right in front of us.
Right.
It's more about understanding how and why.
Yeah.
How did this guy manage to stay under the radar for so long?
Right.
And how did evolving technology finally bring him to justice?
Exactly. It's like a puzzle where we have most of the pieces.
Yeah.
But we need to figure out how they all fit together.
Mm.
All right, so we know these murders happened in the early 90s.
Right.
But before we even get to the first murder, we need to talk about Hurricane Andrew. Ripped through Florida just days after the second murder and, well, kind of threw everything into chaos.
It must have been mayhem.
Yeah.
Investigators are trying to piece together clues. Families are desperate for answers.
Right.
And suddenly you've got this massive hurricane that hits.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder that real life doesn't just stop for a murder investigation.
Right.
And sometimes those external factors can play a huge role in how a case unfolds.
It must have been incredibly frustrating for everyone involved.
Oh, absolutely.
The whole world is focused on the hurricane's aftermath.
Yeah,
And meanwhile, you have these families grieving and searching for answers.
of course.
I mean, how do you even begin to investigate a murder when the entire community is in a state of emergency?
Well, you do the best you can with what you have at the time.
Right.
But it's, without a doubt, a very difficult situation.
Yeah.
So let's go back to August 22, 1992, just days before Hurricane Andrew hit.
Okay.
Rita Ann Bedout and her daughter, Lisa Ann, were found murdered in their apartment in Lantana, Florida.
Oh, wow.
Brutal scene bound, partially nude, shot.
That's horrific.
Yeah.
I can only imagine what their loved ones went through.
Dan, it's hard to even comprehend, right?
Was there any sign of forced entry?
I don't know about that, but
Did the police have any immediate leads?
there were some leads,
Okay.
like Lisa Botto's car being found abandoned.
Okay.
But remember, this was before DNA technology really took off.
Right.
Investigators relied on fingerprints, eyewitness accounts, things like that.
Right.
And with the hurricane hitting, everything just ground to a halt.
So the Botto case goes cold.
Right.
But then there's another murder that happened even earlier, right?
Yeah.
In December of 1991.
Yes, about 8 months before the Botto murders.
Okay.
A man named Martin Gatto was found stabbed to death in his apartment, also in Lantana.
Okay.
Now, initially, investigators didn't connect these two cases.
Right.
The Gatto murder seemed like an isolated incident, maybe a robbery gone wrong.
So they had no reason to suspect a serial killer was operating in the area.
Not at that point. The methods were different, the victims seemingly unconnected.
Okay.
And back then, the idea of a serial killer wasn't as prevalent in the public consciousness as it is today.
Right.
So flash forward almost a decade later, in 2001, this James Anthony Frederick pops up on their radar.
Okay.
He was already imprisoned in Wisconsin for armed robbery.
Wow.
But he had a history in Florida.
Okay.
Frederick had lived in Palm Beach County, not far from Lantana,
Okay.
around the time of the murders.
Okay.
He also had a pretty extensive criminal record: arson, drug dealing, resisting arrest.
Wow.
He fit the profile of someone who might be capable of violence.
So they brought him in for questioning.
Right.
Did he confess?
He didn't confess right away.
Okay.
But this is where the story takes a really interesting turn.
Okay.
In the late 90s and early 2000s, DNA technology was advancing rapidly,
Right.
and a system called CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, was changing the way we investigated crimes.
Okay, break that down for me.
Sure.
What exactly is CODIS?
Right.
And how did it play a role in this case?
Think of CODIS as a massive national database of DNA profiles. It allows law enforcement to compare DNA samples from crime scenes to the DNA of convicted offenders.
Okay.
And in 2003, they decided to run DNA samples from the Botto crime scene through CODIS,
Right.
cigarette butts and a hair.
And that's how they connected Frederick to the Botto murders.
Exactly.
Wow.
They got a match.
Okay.
His DNA was on those cigarette butts at the crime scene.
Wow, so they finally had their guy.
Yeah, you could say that.
But what about Martin Gatto, the first victim?
Yeah.
Did they just forget about him?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Remember, this is all happening in the early 2000s. Investigators were starting to realize the power of DNA to connect seemingly unrelated crimes.
Okay.
So in 2006, they decided to run Frederick's DNA against evidence from the Gatto crime scene.
Yeah.
Another hit.
Wow.
His DNA was there too.
Oh, wow.
What initially seemed like an isolated incident was now directly linked to Frederick. It was a powerful demonstration of how DNA analysis could rewrite the narrative of a case and reveal connections that were previously invisible.
Hold on, I need a minute to process this.
Okay.
2 murders, a hurricane, a decade-long wait for justice, and then, bam, DNA cracks the case wide open.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It's incredible and a little bit terrifying to think about the power of this technology.
It is remarkable.
Yeah.
And it does raise some important questions about how we use this technology.
Right.
The ethical considerations, the potential impact on privacy.
Well, hold on a second.
Okay.
Before we go down that rabbit hole,
Sure.
let's get back to Frederick.
Okay.
He was convicted of the Bedotto murders based on the DNA evidence, right?
Yes. He was charged and convicted in 2003, receiving 2 life sentences.
But the story doesn't end there, does it?
Nope.
I mean, there's something about a confession, right?
You're right.
Hmm.
The case takes yet another unexpected turn.
Oh, really?
In 2005, while already serving those life sentences for the Beto murders, Frederick confessed.
Wait, what? Why would he confess after he'd already been convicted?
Yeah, it's unusual.
Was he trying to get a lighter sentence or something?
It seems like the opposite, actually.
Really?
According to the information you provided, he was adamant about taking full responsibility for his actions.
Oh.
He even waived his right to appeal.
That's strange.
Yeah.
Most criminals in his position would be doing everything they could to overturn their convictions.
That's usually the case, yeah.
Why confess?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Was it genuine remorse?
You're
A
right.
need to clear his conscience?
Okay.
Or maybe a desire to control the narrative?
Mm-hmm.
We may never know for sure what motivated his confession,
Right.
but it adds another layer of complexity to an already fascinating case.
Okay, so we've got 2 murders, a hurricane, years of waiting, DNA evidence, and a confession.
It's a lot to unpack.
And we haven't even gotten to the aliases yet.
You're right.
So much more to uncover here.
There is...
But before we move on, let's take a step back and think about what we've learned so far.
Okay.
What stands out to you?
Well, for me, it's the impact of Hurricane Andrew.
Right.
I mean, it's just mind-blowing to think that a natural disaster could have such a profound effect on a murder investigation.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the DNA evidence.
Right.
It's like something out of a science fiction movie. This ability to reach back in time and identify a killer years after the fact.
It is pretty amazing.
It is.
Those are great points.
Thanks.
And it's a reminder that these cases aren't just about facts and evidence.
Right.
There are real people at the heart of every investigation.
Absolutely.
The victims, their families, the investigators who dedicate their lives to seeking justice.
You're absolutely right.
It's easy to get caught up in the forensic details,
It is.
but we can't forget the human cost of these crimes.
Well said.
Absolutely.
All right, you ready to dive into the world of aliases?
Oh, I'm all ears.
All right, because this is where things get really intriguing. So the Wikipedia article lists a bunch of aliases for Frederick, David, Anthony Fenton, J. Frederick, David Allen Kirchner, James Reichard.
Wow, that's a lot of names.
It makes you wonder why someone would go through the trouble of creating so many different identities.
Yeah, it's not like he was a spy or something.
Right.
Was he just trying to be mysterious?
Yeah.
Or was there a more practical reason for all these different names?
Well, remember, this guy had a long criminal history.
Right.
Arson, drug dealing, armed robbery.
Yeah.
He was constantly in and out of trouble with the law.
Right.
It's not a stretch to think he was using these aliases to avoid detection, to stay one step ahead of the authorities.
So it was less about being mysterious and more about being a ghost,
Right.
disappearing and reappearing whenever it suited him.
Exactly.
Each alias was like a new mask he could put on,
Yeah.
a way to blend in and avoid scrutiny.
It's a pretty common tactic among career criminals,
Right.
especially those who move around a lot.
Speaking of moving around, wasn't there something about Frederick being featured on a TV show?
Ah, yes, that's right.
What?
The Bedot case was actually featured on an episode of A Current Affair back in 1993.
A Current Affair.
Yeah,
That tabloid-style show with the dramatic music and the reenactments?
that's the one.
Wow.
Now, you might think, okay, that's a bit cheesy, maybe even exploitative.
Right.
But remember, this was before the internet, before social media.
Right.
Shows like A Current Affair were often the only way for local crimes to get national attention.
So they were hoping to generate some leads,
Yeah.
maybe jog someone's memory.
Right.
Someone out there had to have seen something, known something that could help the investigation.
Exactly.
Right.
They were casting a wider net, hoping to reach someone who might have a piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
And while it's not clear from the sources whether the episode directly led to any breakthroughs,
Okay.
it does show how the media can play a role in these kinds of investigations, for better or worse.
Okay, so we've got Hurricane Andrew throwing a wrench in the investigation, a tabloid TV show trying to drum up leads, a criminal with a knack for disappearing.
Yeah.
It all seems a bit chaotic, frankly.
Well, that's often the reality of criminal investigations.
Right?
It's rarely a straight line from crime to conviction.
Yeah.
There are twists and turns, dead ends, and unexpected hurdles along the way.
Right, and in this case, it seems like the biggest hurdle was the limitations of forensic science at the time.
Yeah.
If DNA technology hadn't advanced so rapidly in the late 90s and early 2000s, who knows if Frederick would ever have been connected to these murders.
It's very possible he wouldn't have
Right.
entered CODIS.
Right.
But how does CODIS actually work?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like magic.
Right.
Take a tiny piece of evidence, run it through the system, and boom,
Right.
you've got a match.
It is pretty amazing.
Yeah,
Imagine a giant library filled with books,
okay.
and each book contains the DNA profile of a convicted offender. Now, imagine you have a DNA sample from a crime scene.
Okay.
CODIS acts like a librarian, helping you quickly search through that entire library to see if there's a match.
So it's not just about having the DNA sample.
Right.
It's about having a way to compare it to a massive database of known offenders.
Precisely.
Okay.
And the beauty of CODIS is that it's constantly growing.
Right.
Every time someone is convicted of a qualifying offense,
Okay.
their DNA profile is added to the database.
Right.
It's like having a safety net,
Okay.
a way to catch criminals even years after they've committed a crime.
It's almost like a superpower, this ability to reach back in time
It is.
and find that one crucial piece of evidence that cracks the case wide open.
It's a powerful tool, no doubt.
Yeah.
And it's not just about solving murders.
Right.
CODIS has been used to exonerate innocent people, to identify missing persons,
Right.
and to connect families separated by war or disaster.
Wow. So this technology has implications far beyond catching criminals.
That's right.
It's about finding answers, about bringing closure, about revealing the truth, even when it seems lost forever.
Well said.
Yeah.
But let's not forget that with any powerful tool, there are potential downsides.
Right.
We have to consider the ethical implications,
Right.
the potential for misuse, the questions about privacy and civil liberties.
That's a valid point.
It is.
It's a slippery slope.
Yeah,
On one hand, you want to use every tool at your disposal to solve crimes and bring justice to victims.
of course.
But on the other hand, you don't want to create a system where everyone's DNA is on file and easily accessible.
Right.
It's a delicate balance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And those are conversations we need to be having as a society.
Right.
How do we harness the power of this technology
Right.
without compromising our values and our freedoms?
Okay, so we've talked about Hurricane Andrew,
Mm-hmm.
the media's role in the investigation,
Right.
the power of CODIS,
Right.
and the ethical considerations of DNA technology.
Right.
But there's still one piece of the puzzle that I'm struggling to understand. Yeah.
Frederick's confession.
Right.
Why would he confess after he'd already been convicted?
It's an unusual twist in an already complex story,
Yeah.
and it raises so many questions.
Yeah.
So what was he hoping to achieve?
Right.
Was it a genuine expression of remorse or something else entirely?
Right.
Let's explore those questions and see if we can uncover what might have been going through Frederick's mind when he decided to confess to these horrific crimes.
So we've got a convicted killer serving multiple life sentences,
Right.
and he decides to confess.
Yeah,
It just doesn't add up.
it is unusual.
What was the point?
Well, there are a few possibilities.
Okay.
Maybe it was just a genuine expression of remorse.
Yeah.
You know, he'd been living with this burden for over a decade.
Right.
Maybe he just needed to get it off his chest.
But wouldn't he have confessed sooner?
That's a good question.
I mean, he had plenty of time to come clean before the DNA evidence even came into play.
You'd think so, but sometimes that weight of guilt doesn't hit you right away.
It can fester and grow over time,
Right.
especially when you're facing the reality of spending the rest of your life behind bars.
Okay, so maybe it was remorse, but
Yeah.
there could be other explanations, right?
Absolutely.
Like
But
what?
some psychologists believe that confessions,
Okay.
even false ones,
Okay.
can be a way for criminals to exert control over a situation where they feel powerless.
Okay.
In Frederick's case,
Right.
he'd been caught, convicted, sentenced.
Right.
He had no control over any of that.
Right.
So by confessing,
Right.
He was taking back some of that control,
Right.
shaping the narrative of his own crimes.
So he was saying, I'm not just a pawn in your legal system. I'm
Bam.
the author of my own story.
Right.
And sometimes that sense of control, however twisted it may be,
Yeah.
can be a powerful motivator. It's a disturbing thought, but it makes a certain kind of sense.
It does.
Almost like a final act of defiance.
You could see it that way, yeah.
But there's another possibility we haven't considered yet. Maybe he was trying to protect someone.
Protect someone.
Yeah.
Who would he be protecting at that point?
Right.
I mean, he was already going to spend the rest of his life in prison.
That's what I'm saying.
We can only speculate, of course.
Right.
But maybe there was an accomplice we don't know about.
Okay.
Maybe someone helped him commit these crimes, and he was taking the fall to keep them safe.
That's a chilling thought.
It
Adds a whole new layer of mystery to this case.
It does. And it reminds us that we may never have all the answers.
Right.
We have the DNA evidence, the convictions, the confession,
Right.
but there are still gaps in our understanding of what really happened and why.
Okay, so we've explored a few possible explanations for Frederick's confession. Remorse, a need for control,
Yeah.
maybe even a desire to protect someone.
It's possible.
But I have to ask,
Okay.
do you think he was telling the truth?
It's impossible to know for sure what was going on in his mind.
Right.
But the fact that he confessed at all, after already being convicted,
Yeah.
suggests that there was something more to the story.
Okay.
Something he felt compelled to reveal.
So even with the DNA evidence and the convictions, there's still an element of mystery.
There is.
Of unanswered questions.
For sure.
And that's part of what makes these deep dives so fascinating.
Very.
We're not just rehashing old facts. We're trying to understand the human element, the complexities of motive and behavior.
Absolutely.
We're grappling with the darkness that can lurk within seemingly ordinary people.
Well said.
And let's not forget the victims in all of this.
Yeah.
Martin Gatto, Rita Ambato, Lisa Ambato.
Right.
Their lives were cut short by this man's actions.
It's tragic.
Their families had to endure years of uncertainty,
Of course.
waiting for answers, for justice.
It's heartbreaking.
It's a sobering reminder that every crime, every case file represents a human tragedy.
Absolutely.
And while we may never fully comprehend the depths of their pain, we can honor their memories by seeking the truth and holding perpetrators accountable.
I think that's very important.
So where do we go from here?
Well,
What happens next in the James Anthony Frederick saga?
Well, he's currently serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole.
Right?
So in a legal sense, the case is closed.
Okay.
But the story doesn't necessarily end there.
What do you mean?
Well, remember all those aliases Frederick used.
Right.
The fact that he was so adept at disappearing and reappearing
Right.
makes you wonder if there are other crimes out there that haven't been connected to him yet.
Oh, wow, you're right.
Yeah.
He was a transient criminal, moving from state to state, leaving a trail of chaos in his wake.
Right.
Who knows how many other lives he might have impacted?
It's impossible to know, for sure.
And with the advancements in DNA technology happening all the time,
Yeah,
it's entirely possible that new connections will be made in the future.
that's right.
Cold cases are being reopened and solved all the time thanks to DNA databases like Cody's.
It's pretty incredible.
So even though Frederick is behind bars,
Right.
this story isn't over.
It may not be.
There might be other victims out there,
Yeah.
other families waiting for answers.
That's a sobering thought,
It is.
but it's also a testament to the power of perseverance.
Right.
We can't give up on these cold cases.
Right.
We owe it to the victims and their families to keep searching for the truth no matter how long it takes.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about today.
It's a fascinating case.
This case has been a wild ride, a hurricane, a tabloid TV show, a groundbreaking technology,
Yeah,
a confession that raises more questions than it answers.
it sure does.
It's a reminder that truth can be elusive,
Mm-hmm.
but it's always worth pursuing.
I agree.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of James Anthony Frederick.
My pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.